Total War Pharaoh is coming out in a few months, and let's be honest, not everyone is deeply read in Bronze Age history, and a lot of sources deal with the fall of the 19th Dynasty in only a few paragraphs. So this is the first of a few lore videos to get you situated. To start with, I'm going to assume that you know where Egypt is. And I assume you know that the main feature in Egypt is the Nile River. And you've also heard that Egyptian history is super old. Like really crazy old. The first king of a unified Egypt was a guy named Narmer, sometimes called Menes. He's the one about to beat the tar out of the other guy on this picture. And he lived sometime maybe 3100 BC-ish. The pyramids would be built 500 years later, and since the USA is about 250 years old, that means that you could fit all of US history in there twice before Egypt even started building pyramids. The pyramids would continue being built for 500 more years, so that's another 2 USAs. After the end of the Pyramid Age, there's pretty much close to exactly 1,000 years of Egyptian history before we get to the events of Total War Pharaoh. So that's another 4 USAs. And after the game ends, there's still a whole millennium of Egyptian history left to go before Cleopatra, the final ruler of Old Egypt, before it's subsumed by the Romans, then later by the Muslims, at which point it becomes a kind of different Egypt. So that's a grand total of 12 USAs that could fit into the history of Egypt. So that's the context here. That 3,000-year span of time is divided into periods called dynasties. There's maybe 31 or 33 of them, depending on how you count, each lasting on average 100 years. We are interested in the greatest of all Egyptian dynasties here, the 19th dynasty. And we're starting our story with the greatest of all Egyptian pharaohs, Ramesses the Great. You could tell he was pretty great by that "the Great" on the end of his name. Backing up just a bit, the 19th dynasty rose from the ashes of the 18th dynasty, which has some pretty famous folks in it. 18th dynasty saw Egypt conquer a good chunk of modern-day Israel and places around there. It saw the famous queen Hatshepsut. It had Akhenaten, a guy who tried to change Egyptian religion to only have one god. It had King Tut, who wasn't actually super significant. He's just really famous because we found his tomb completely intact. And then after King Tut, the dynasty sort of fell apart. The pieces were picked up by a fella named Ramesses, but not the famous one. This was Ramesses the First, and he dies like a year or two after becoming pharaoh. His son was Seti the First, who lives a good bit longer and manages a pretty successful kingship, doing some building, some conquering, and generally creating a stable foundation. After Seti, his son is Ramesses II, and this guy is the big name in Egyptian history. In the movies, you've seen him as the Pharaoh of the Exodus more than once, played most famously by Yul Brynner, but also plenty other big names, Charles de Rochefort way back when, Richard Pryor, more recently Ralph Fiennes and Joel Edgerton. Leaving aside Hollywood pap and a sticky religious question, Ramesses was an unstoppable juggernaut. One of his first acts was to build a whole new city for himself. Pi Ramesses, it's even got his name in it. Of course, he didn't build it, and he hired a bunch of workmen and also probably slaves, and they built it, but he gets the credit for it. This city wasn't just a vanity project, though. One of the biggest concerns for the Egyptian government at this point is their foreign borderlands, which at this point are somewhere not too far from the modern Israel-Lebanon border. Not only is the entire land of Canaan a jumbled mess, nominally under control of Egypt, but in reality a bunch of tiny tribals and princelings jockeying for position under their overlord, but it borders the most powerful rival empire of the age, the Hittites from modern-day Turkey. The two empires are at a point in history where Egypt cannot expand any further into the rich trade cities of Syria without pushing into Hittite territory, and the Hittites cannot take the trade routes further south without pushing into Egyptian territory. At this point, the two kingdoms have two options. They can have a massive battle, or they can make peace. As it happens, they try both. The Battle of Kadesh will probably feature as one of the custom battles in-game, even though it did happen a generation before the main campaign, and features as many as 50,000 men on either side, though some estimates have it a good bit less. It was a tactical victory for Egypt, but a strategic win for the Hittites, and ultimately the border between the two empires was firmed up in the oldest known peace treaty in world history. Like, we know there were older treaties, but that's the oldest one we still have. This peace between the Hittites and Egyptians, after having been in a state of on and off conflict for generations, would prove to last until the final destruction of the Hittite Empire during the Bronze Age collapse. But Ramesses was king for maybe 66 years, ruling until he was 90 or 91 years old, so he had plenty of time to do way more than just this one battle. In fact, that one battle was a culmination of 5 campaigns into Syria. His two other fronts also saw battle. Nubia, the southern lands along the Nile into modern-day Sudan, saw multiple campaigns, including one battle where Ramesses claims to have fought for at least a time without any of his soldiers around to help. These were generally successful, but the ancient kingdom was limited in how far it could push just by logistical concerns. Similarly, either Ramesses or his father took control of Libya, and a number of smaller campaigns were needed to keep the region pacified and push against the North Africans on the far side of the border. Even in the north, usually a relatively peaceful direction since that's just the Mediterranean Sea, was starting to turn violent during Ramesses' reign. The Shurden may have been indigenous pirates, or they could have been among the first sea peoples. Either way, Pharaoh doesn't care where you come from, he just cares that you submit or die. And the Shurden seem to have mostly done the second, as we don't hear much about them in later history. But all that conquest is only part of the reason that Ramesses II is remembered as Ramesses the Great. He also built a ton of stuff all over Egypt, ensuring that his legacy would last forever. In fact, he ordered that his monument builders carve his inscriptions much deeper than normal at great expense to ensure that the engravings would last longer and would be harder for someone else's graffiti to mess his stuff up. He tagged his name on just about everything and built like 1.5 million statues of himself all over Egypt. That famous cliffside building with the 4 giant pharaohs in front of it, yeah, that was him. A massive temple complex called the Ramesseum still partly stands near Luxor, and just the still standing parts are huge. We mentioned that he built Pi Ramesses from scratch so that he could manage Canaan more easily, but that wasn't just a military outpost. It was a luxurious palace complex full of fancy temples and even had its own zoo. But even though he lived an extraordinarily long time, he did eventually die. He wasn't buried in a pyramid. No one had been building pyramids for 1,000 years by this point, but he did have a lavish tomb and mortuary temple. The tomb was in the famous Valley of the Kings, and left behind somewhere between 90 and 110 children, not counting grandchildren. This guy was the inspiration for Ozymandias in the various incarnations of that figure, and for Warhammer fans, this is Settra the Imperishable, from the terrifying chariot skills down to the comically long list of titles. But getting so old also made its share of problems. He managed to outlive his 12 oldest sons, and so his successor was his 13th son, Merneptah, who was himself maybe around 70 at this point and possibly already suffering arthritis. And he had to deal with an Egypt which was, at this point, in decline. His father, in the latter years, seems to have slowed down considerably, as happens with really old people, and Merneptah comes to power seemingly without a whole lot of momentum behind him. We don't hear about succession struggles at this point, but with so many sons of the previous pharaoh hanging around, it's hard to imagine that there wasn't a fair bit of intrigue going on, enough for Merneptah to move out of his father's capital city of Pi-Ramesses back to the traditional capital of Memphis, symbolizing a focus away from expansion and back towards domestic stability, the choice of someone who may not be secure on their throne. That's not to say he was militarily unsuccessful, just that the context of his wars was a bit more desperate. The Libyans were encroaching, and he beat them back. The dreaded sea peoples arrived in the Nile Delta, and he beat them back. The various peoples of Canaan, including famously the early Israelites, were getting a bit independent, and he beat them all up. In all this frantic movement, he did not seem to have nearly as much time for construction or domestic improvements, though things seem to have been broadly okay if you were an Egyptian in the Egyptian heartland at this point, as far as we can tell. He was already old at accession, but he still managed to live another decade into his 80s before dying right around 1203 BCE. I should mention that specific date, like many in the Late Bronze Age, is a bit of a chronologically difficult one to establish firmly. There are a few different proposals for how the entire timeline looks. Some shifted just a few years here and there, some shifted more significantly, and for the most part, these aren't fringe theories here, or they're not people with agendas, but it's scholars reconstructing minute details of ancient documents in slightly different ways, like putting together a jigsaw puzzle without all the pieces, and also some of those pieces could fit in more than one spot. But this date is important because it's where, as far as we can tell, the game Total War Pharaoh begins, with the death of Merneptah. It will be interesting to see if they go with 1203, or a nice round 1200, or some other proposed date, or if they leave off the dates altogether, just because chronology can be hard without a whole lot of reward to it. With the death of Merneptah, 5 of our 8 playable factions at release are somewhere in Egypt, either vying for the throne directly or securing their own power base for later. Seti and Amenmessa are the 2 immediate players. Tauseret and Bey are the political manipulators waiting in the wings, and Irsu and Ramesses are still young, with their glory days still to come. But we will be looking at all these guys, plus the Hittites up north, in subsequent lore videos. So make sure you're subscribed to this channel with whatever likes and notifications that the YouTube wants to please the algorithm, because we will be covering both the history of this period and, when released, the gameplay of Total War Pharaoh. If you are a bit negative on the game, I already released a video about why I'm perhaps more positive than I have been for a while on the historical side of the franchise, so maybe give that a look. And until then, thanks for watching.